After 24 hours without sleep, she pushed open the wrong door. Her hand lingered on the cold metal handle for a second too long, fingers sticky with the last bottle of hand sanitizer, a smear of coffee trailing down the side of her green scrubs like a small brown flag. The street smelled of rain and exhaust and the kind of city fatigue that sets into the soles of your shoes. A black sedan idled at the curb, engine humming a patient, affluent sound. A leather glove tapped the dashboard. A voice, thin with irritation and time, said, "Excuse me, get out of my car." Clara Mendonça blinked once, then twice, counting the beats in her chest. Her name tag, bent at an angle from 100 shifts, caught a glint of light. She had been up for a day and a night. Her palms were raw from the straps of an IV pump and the coarse weave of a hospital blanket. People told her she moved like a machine during long shifts. She had learned to keep the machine warm, to hide the rattling. Now a stranger's impatience landed on her like a jar of cold water. She stepped back, lips pressed into a line, dignity and exhaustion balanced like two plates in her hands. The car door closed with an offended click. On the sidewalk, Seu Geraldo, hospital porter, someone who had the kind of face that registered everything and said little, watched from across the street with his cap in his hand. He had seen Clara come and go for years. He knew the way her shoulders tightened after a long night, knew the small rituals, the hand that rubbed the bridge of the nose, the way she set a single cup of coffee on the nurse's station like an offering to the next hour. The man in the car, Leonardo Avelar, was 38, but carried the weight of family expectation on a carefully combed head. The watch on his wrist made a soft, precise noise when he checked it. He was handsome in the way wealth often is, practiced, sealed against the mess of other people's need. His voice, when he stepped out, held apology stripped of warmth. There must be a mistake. Clara could have explained. She could have said she was headed to the hospital after a marathon shift, that her brain traded addresses, and that any other minute this would be a ridiculous human mistake. She could have let the man's impatience wash over her. She could have made the error small and private. Instead, she straightened her spine, took a breath that tasted of antiseptic and late coffee, and walked away. Behind her, the sedan's taillights winked like a closing offered. Seu Geraldo called after her, something that could have been apology, could have been condolence. She did not turn. The walk back to the hospital was a corridor of light and shadow, shop windows with mannequins, a bus rumbling, the occasional shout. In the small dark between one block and another, she folded the wrong car into her pocket like a stone. The city swallowed the moment. Inside the doors of Hospital Vitali, the smell of disinfectant and linen rose to meet her like a second skin. Night shift nurses moved with the kind of quiet choreography that only hospitals know. A tray placed gently on a bed rail, a monitor's soft beep in a patterned lullaby, a cart rolling with the measured momentum of small emergencies. Clara slid into that rhythm as if she had never left. She checked charts, adjusted an infusion, smoothed a patient's hair with a fingertip that remembered how to be tender. Donna Lourdes Avelar lay in room 412, with the light from the ward window catching at the corners of her face like a halo that had no religious intent, just the warm gold of afternoon sun. At 67, she had the kind of presence that made people speak differently, softer, as if they were handling something fragile and immense at once. She watched Clara come to the bed with an almost maternal approval, like a person who recognizes the hand that will hold theirs in a storm. "Ah, my nurse," Donna Lourdes said, voice like paper under a lamp. "You always arrive with the light." Clara offered a tired smile and took the chart. The monitor's numbers were patient tonight, breathing a steady rhythm that felt like a small miracle in itself. Clara adjusted the oxygen, spoke to Donna Lourdes in the even human voice practiced so well in ICUs. No false cheer, just presence. The older woman's fingers found Clara's hand and squeezed. A simple contract. Stay. At the nurse's station, Dr. Fabio Assunção stood over a computer, buttoning his white coat with the detached precision of someone who navigated life by lists. He watched the ward through a pair of eyes, professional and plain. He had been Clara's supervisor intermittently over the years, the man who could give assent to a treatment or sign for a rearrangement of the staff. He nodded at Clara as she passed. "Good work on the last shift," he said, clinical but warm in the way that counts. Renata Souza, the nursing coordinator, was a presence in another register. Administrative, unflinching, the person hospital bodies summoned when things needed to be kept orderly. Renata's face was set in a firmness that made people hesitate before they lied. She had been the one to approve Clara's long stretch of shifts months ago, the one who quietly patched a schedule seam so the unit would not unravel. "Clara," Renata said later that afternoon, voice low and precise when she called the nurse into a small office. "Leonardo Avelar asked to see your name. He was here earlier." The words landed like a file sliding into place. Clara's stomach folded once. The wrong car felt like a coal she could not spit out. She began, searching for a modal verb that would make the moment less sharp. "He says there was an incident outside. He asked that his mother be attended by someone else." Renata's fingers were still on a tablet, scrolling through an administrative world that had its own brutal clarity. "He offered to arrange coverage." Renata's jaw did not move. Her refusal to that offer was immediate and quiet. "We don't operate on offers like that, not here." Leonardo waited in the visitor's lounge, hand smoothing the crease of his trousers. He read, then reread, the small print of a hospital pamphlet, as if it might teach him what to do next. When he spoke to the front desk, he was courteous, apologetic, in a way that still kept the edge of being in control. There was an awkwardness to his mouth when he said he wanted the best for his mother that was different from the arrogance of privilege. It was the particular unease of someone who had been taught to buy solutions and discovered they mattered less when a life hung in balance. He watched Clara in the ward, how she moved, the way patients turned toward her like vessels toward a lighthouse. Something in him twined between admiration and annoyance. The image of the wrong door rose up again, an evening when he had been preoccupied, when the world had blurred into black leather and muffled curses. He had ordered her out before asking. His voice had been his weapon. Now, in the dome of the hospital's calm, that voice felt absurd and loud. He found the nurse by the window, where the ward let in late light and dust. "Miss Mendonça," he said, that practiced not too familiar tone people use when they try to be conciliatory and fail. There was an apology beneath it, uneasy and incomplete. "About earlier." Clara looked at him, the lines of her fatigue etched plainly. There was no readiness in her to be mollified. Before she could answer, Dona Lourdes's eyes, half closed with relaxation, fluttered. She opened them like someone reading a familiar book. The mother and son exchanged a look that needed no explanation. History lived in the small glances. Leonardo's apology turned into an offer, funds for additional private care, perhaps a placement in a quieter room, a request to ensure a higher nurse-to-patient ratio for his mother. The words were silvered with advantage. He spoke of convenience and comfort as though they were things the hospital sold. Renata's face did not change. Dr. Fabio's eyes, when they met Leonardo's, were a calm barrier. "We don't accept favors that influence clinical decisions," Renata said. She did not say it to wound. She said it to close a door. Clara watched the exchange like a woman on the other side of a glass. Inside, feelings knotted, relief, the bite of humiliation fed by the wrong car, and the constant soft ache of duty. Still, Leonardo pushed. He was the son who could not help thinking in terms of what money could fix. "I only want my mother to have the best," he said, and his voice carried the honest, dangerous conviction of someone used to outcomes bending to his will. You could see the calculation in his eyes. If money failed here, what else could be used? He had access, he had influence, he had a sense, learned and refined, that institutions could be guided by the right touch. Renata refused, quietly, but with a posture that made the lobby air colder. "At Hospital Vitali, we base assignments on clinical need," she said. "If you have concerns about your mother's care, you speak to the medical team. We'll respond through the proper channels." Leonardo left with the posture of someone not used to being said no to. The courtesy remained, but it had seams, thin, exposed places where shame might set in. He walked past Seu Geraldo, who greeted him with a nod that said more than any small talk could. So Geraldo's eyes lingered for a moment on Clara, an empathetic punctuation. News moved in a hospital like a current. Words carried faster than bodies, rumors bred in the air-conditioning ducts and in the tired exchanges between staff. At the end of the shift, in the break room where fluorescent light flattened faces, a small group gathered. Patricia, a nursing technician whose laugh came easily and who had the stamina of a longshoreman. Anna, a younger nurse still learning to be careful with the edges of grief. And Clara, who took her cup of coffee like a rite. "Did you see the man in the sedan?" Patricia asked, curiosity without malice. She had been the one to tidy Donna Lourdes' hair that morning. "Leonardo Avila, right? I saw him talk to Renata." Clara stirred her coffee until the brown smear on her scrubs melded into a darker ring. She made herself small within a laugh that did not ask for sympathy. "Yes, he was insistent." Patricia folded her hands. "You handled it. Don't let it get to you." But it did get to her. It lodged in her chest like a pebble. A weight that had nothing to do with the patient's vitals, and everything to do with being seen and dismissed in the same breath. She could feel the institutional scaffolding lean in new ways when power knocked politely. The hospital had rules and a pulse. It also had people who could move currents by the tilt of a well-timed note. That night, the ward hummed. Monitors blinked, corridors swallowed footsteps, and the coffee pot kept a sad, small heat on the counter. Clara walked the rounds with the slow efficiency that had kept lives whole for 8 years in ICU. A patient who slept fitfully reached for a pillow, and she adjusted it without looking away from the chart. A nurse called for a dose adjustment, and she gave the order with a precision that was more muscle than thought. At 3 in the morning, when the building breathed quietly in the hours between crises, Dr. Fabio stopped by her station. He looked less like a list and more like someone briefly off script. "Clara," he said, "Leonardo spoke to administration. He lodged a report, an unpleasant exchange described outside the hospital." He chose his words with the care of someone who knows what an unguarded sentence can do to a career. Clara's mouth tightened. Her mind aligned the building blocks of what might come, a complaint, an administrative note, perhaps a formal query. "Outside?" she echoed. He nodded. "There's a protocol. They usually open a preliminary inquiry when there's a complaint that involves staff. Renata will handle it. For now, keep your regular documentation thorough. Avoid any confrontations. Let the process run. And Clara," he added with a look that carried years of hospital experience, "if you need support, ask for it. Support in the language of hospitals, often translated into paperwork and signatures, into coverage swaps and notes, filed under codes and timestamps. It rarely softened the sting of being told your presence was optional by someone with a car and a watch. Still, Dr. Fabio's look was a bridge. His voice carried a small kindness that meant someone inside the system recognized the risk. Clara nodded. She felt the long thread of fatigue travel up and down her spine, like a patient being repositioned in bed. She made a decision, alongside the clatter of coffee cups and the soft beep of late monitors. She would take no impulsive step that might harm Donna Lourdes. The older woman's stability hung in part on ritual and trust. Clara's presence was a factor in both. To be removed suddenly would be to risk a patient's equilibrium for the sake of paperwork. That night, as the city blue swung toward dawn, Clara sat in a quiet corner of the ward and let memory come. Brief, domestic fragments to steady her. Her grandmother's hands teaching how to fold laundry with care. The smell of boiled coffee in the mornings of her childhood, a stern woman who taught that work was how you preserved someone's dignity. Her grandmother had not made struggles pretty. She had made them bearable. Clara heard that voice now, not as instruction but as lineage. To stay where you are needed is noble yet costly. To leave can be a mercy too. She made a practical choice that felt like both humility and defiance. She would document every intervention with her usual fastidiousness. She would make sure notes reflected the truth. Times, dosages, conversations. She would not let a moment outside the hospital be allowed to rewrite her inside life. But she would also consider prudent steps for the patient's protection. If the hospital asked that she be removed while the inquiry ran, that would be a cost she would bear. She would not make the decision for another. The days that followed were a study in small violences and slow adjustments. Leonardo's presence in the hospital became a metronome, a repeated beat that paced everyone's nerves. He came often, sometimes with florals, sometimes with a pale smile, sometimes with a brief chat with the nurse's station that was more observation than conversation. Each time he left, there was the hint of a ledger, what he had given, what he might ask for. Renata kept her steady eye on staff assignments. She did not gossip. She barely listened to rumor. Her way was to act. She started scheduling more formal meetings, asking for written statements from anyone who had been present around the evening of the car incident. The hospital's internal processes unfolded not with spectacle, but with a sober practicalness. Emails, stamped forms, an entry into the staff log that would be printed and read by committees. The bureaucracy was not a monster. It was a machine that ground small things into records. Patricia sat with Clara one night and pressed a hand on her forearm where a vein had been used for blood draws. "If they try to make you leave the case," she said, "we'll cover you. We'll cover shifts, paperwork, whatever. You don't have to do this alone." Clara looked at Patricia and felt the lift of that small human thing, a colleague's solidarity. It was not a grand rescue. It was a rope tossed at ankle height so you could take a step without stumbling. These were the things that kept people in hospitals from burning out entirely. The tape that held the edges of schedules together, the willing hand that would chart a course when the official channels froze. And in the middle of these mundane ablutions, small human moments persisted. Donna Lourdes, when lucid, insisted that Clara have tea on a particular afternoon, and insisted she stop apologizing for looking tired. She told Clara stories in a voice that had surrendered nothing to time, about a market in her youth, about stubbornness learned at a young age. Leonardo sat in the chair by the window and listened, sometimes softly, sometimes with a face that belonged to someone reconciling private discomfort. In one of these episodes, Leonardo lingered after visiting hours to speak to his mother in a way he might not have in public. His shoulders drooped for a moment. Someone else's anger gives way to the private ache of someone who has watched a parent suffer and found all the money in the world insufficient to pay back the hours they were robbed of. He pressed his hand to Donna Lourdes's, and she smiled at him, not the triumphant mother of business deals, but someone who had known this son as a child. For Clara watching, the scene did not erase the earlier indignity, but it complicated him. She could see more than the car and the watch, a man caught between his sense of entitlement and the sharper pain of watching someone you love be diminished by illness. He was not a cartoon villain. He was, in his own way, human, which made acting against him harder. It made the decision, who to protect, when, how, more complicated. Then the day came, typical, procedural, when Renata called Clara into her office with a face that didn't soften when she spoke. "We received a formal complaint filed by Mr. Avila regarding the incident outside," she said. Her voice was the dry voice of administration. "According to protocol, the Risk Management Department will open a preliminary inquiry. That means there will be statements, timelines to check, and potentially a temporary reassignment if the committee deems it necessary to avoid conflicts of interest." Clara felt the air go thin. A preliminary inquiry. The phrase was sterile and expansive, a net that could catch careers in its weave. She thought for an instant of all the times she had stood between a machine and a human, tape and tenderness as her tools. She thought of Donna Lourdes, steady in bed but fragile by degrees. She thought of the quiet, the way a patient relied on the familiar warmth of a nurse's hand. Renata continued, "This is not a judgment, it's a procedure. I advise you to continue documenting everything. If you wish, we can arrange a witness for your interactions with Donna Lourdes during this period. We want transparency, not upheaval." Clara sat in a chair in the office and felt the cool of its vinyl under her thighs. The wrong car was no longer just a memory. It had metastasized into a formal letter inside a system that loved clear lines and logs. She considered her choices. To stay and risk the possibility of an inquiry that might be used to justify removal. To ask to be taken off the case voluntarily so Donna Lourdes would have unwavering care in a crisis. Or to leave quietly and preserve her own record. Each option weighed like a prescription, each with side effects. Her thoughts tumbled into the private, unspoken ledger she kept. 8 years in ICU, nights that felt like service to a profession that seldom paid back in gratitude, the stories of patients who had judged her not by the skill of her hands, but by the gleam of a watch. She also weighed duty, those fragile human contracts that the hospital had no authority to write, but which she had always kept. Donna Lourdes relied on the rhythm of Clara's presence in ways that the charts could not capture. Renata watched her without intrusion, an administrative figure softened only in the rarest private hours. "You don't have to decide now," she said. "We'll follow protocol. If you want support during the inquiry, legal advice, witness statements, ask. The hospital will provide what is standard." Clara understood what Renata meant by standard, and she also understood its limits. There were things paperwork could not protect. A smear of coffee on a scrub that spoke of a long night, a patient's sleep that broke when a familiar hand was absent. She thought of writing a formal request to be voluntarily removed from the case, an act that would protect the unit from claims that someone's presence favored a patient due to outside relationships, and that would also preserve her professional reputation. It was an act of leaving and of staying, a paradox that suited her tired mind. That night, after rounds, she sat beside Donna Lourdes' bed for a while, letting the older woman's breath mark the hours. "You need rest," Donna Lourdes said, a small reprimand with a mother's cadence. "And you need to be seen, Clara. Don't let them take your light because someone else was rude." Clara wanted to tell her she would not allow anyone to write her off as careless or unprofessional. She wanted to say that a mistake on the street did not equal incompetence at a bedside. Instead, she folded those truths into a silent promise. She would protect Donna Lourdes by presence or by deliberate retreat, whichever the patient needed. She would make the choice that held more dignity. Before she left the ward, she placed a small envelope on the nightstand near Donna Lourdes' hand. It was a slip of paper. Nothing formal, just a note and a thank you. On it she wrote, "For your light, for the afternoons of your hands." It was a private ritual, an offering to the intimacy of care that was not to be filed in any log. Outside, under a sky the pale grey of a city preparing for rain, Leonardo paused by the hospital's small cafe. He had seen Clara in the hall and had considered following her, saying something that could make the awkwardness smaller. Instead, he ordered a coffee he did not drink and sat with his back to the glass, watching the ward through the bureaucracy's little theatre. His guilt was a thin, persistent thing. Money had not erased it. He had taken that car and used a tone that he hadn't meant to have. And the image of the nurse's face as she stepped away existed now as a fact he couldn't remove. Could he ask for forgiveness with a check? He had thought so in the beginning. Now, inside the hospital that worked on bodies and emotions alike, he was learning there were no immediate refunds. When Renata filed the notice that the preliminary inquiry would open, it moved through channels like a quiet wave. Emails were sent, signatures gathered, the administration's language bending into forms. The net tightened in the most ordinary way. Paperwork. Clara read the notice on her hospital email, the subject line small and clinical. Preliminary inquiry, staff interaction outside hospital. Her hands, which had been steady through so many procedures, trembled for a second. She felt exposed, not because she had done something wrong, but because an external moment had been turned into administrative evidence. It was a lesson in how the world can shape a narrative with a few keystrokes. She closed the laptop and stood up. The ward hummed. Donna Lourdes slept with a peacefulness that made Clara's chest unclench. Outside, a city moved on indifferent to the slow human gears being set in motion within the hospital's walls. Clara folded the letter she had left on the nightstand into a smaller square and slid it inside her pocket. She felt in that movement both a fragile protection and the weight of what might come. She would do what she could, document, support, and hold. But if the inquiry moved toward something that threatened to remove her from the patient who needed her, she would have to choose. The choice loomed like the end of a corridor, a place where light met shadow, and a decision had to be made. She thought of her grandmother's hands one more time, of the way those hands had shown her to mend a tear rather than toss the garment away. She thought of service as a repair, not a surrender. At the nurse's station, Renata tapped a note into the system and sighed with the tiredness of someone who carried small bureaucratic fires to the right counters. Dr. Fabio peered over a sheet and then at Clara, giving her a look that was neither plea nor command, but an invitation to make the moral choice of her own. Clara took a breath. The hospital around her a steady machinery of life and lapse. She would not let the wrong door of a night define her skill or her worth. But neither would she let the patient's health become collateral. As the morning light began to slice thin and honest through the ward windows, an email arrived in Clara's inbox with the subject line that made her hands go cool. Request for statement. Risk management. It was the first formal stitch in the fabric of the inquiry. She read it twice, then 3 times, each time feeling the slow tilt of the world beneath her. She picked up the thick paper pad with the hospital's header and a pen, an instrument of both clinical detail and human testimony, and she began to write. Her handwriting was careful at first, each date a small assault on the tiredness in her hands. She wrote the timeline in the methodical way that had kept her from missing a dose or a drip in 8 years of ICU shifts. Time, action, observation. She did not invent drama. She recorded fact. 23:10, left hospital after shift. 23:24, approached vehicle on Avenida Paulista. 23:25, asked to leave the car by driver. 23:27, returned to hospital Vitali. She noted Seu Geraldo's presence at the curb, the weather, the smear of coffee down the side of her scrub top, as if the stain belonged in the chain of events and not merely as a private mark. When she wrote the part about dignity, phrasing a sense she felt rather than a legal claim, her pen wavered and the letters became longer, slower. She described the way the man spoke, the sound of impatience, how she had stepped away and kept walking. She described the bedside she had returned to, Donna Lourdes breathing steadily with a soft tracer of light on her cheek, the squeeze of a patient's fingers that felt like a contract. She did not plead. She did not dramatize. She recorded care, the oxygen adjustments, the medication times, the small conversation about a market from a different decade. She closed with an inventory of witnesses: Patricia on the morning tidy, Seu Geraldo outside, Dr. Fabio's oversight in the ward at small hours, a list that resembled both protection and ordinary human company. Risk management arranged a room with the kind of neutral carpet hospitals favor: beige, unopinionated. The woman who met Clara at the door introduced herself as Marisa. She did not smile, and she did not need to. Her voice was a plain instrument tuned to protocol. Dr. Augusto, Director of Patient Safety, a man whose title carried the weight of committees and form letters, sat against the wall with a tablet. Renata closed the door softly behind them, an administrative gesture that felt like a small defense. "Thank you for coming in, Clara," Marisa said. "We'll record your statement and keep confidentiality as far as we can within the process. There's a preliminary inquiry open based on Mr. Avalar's complaint. We're not here to judge, we're here to gather facts." Clara read the phrase and felt she had heard it before, less a comfort than the unglamorous wood of the building. She handed the page she had written. Marisa scanned it, nodding, while Dr. Augusto typed with economy. "Can you recount the incident for the record?" Marisa asked. Clara did. Her voice had a measured rhythm. She spoke in the short, exact sentences that clinicians learn to use when the vital signs will not be fooled by sentiment. She described the road, the car, Seu Geraldo. She described the sensation of being moved as if by a current, how it landed on her body like a cold plate, and the decision to walk away. She described returning to the ward and resuming the work that, in its own small, fierce way, had rules heavier than strangers' grievances. When she mentioned the smear of coffee, Marisa glanced up briefly, then down. "Did you feel threatened?" she asked. "No," Clara said. "Disrespected, yes. Threatened, no. I was tired." "Thank you," Marisa said. "We'll include that in your statement." The words were bureaucratic, but the inclusion felt like a small seam, someone acknowledging that tiredness mattered. Afterwards, Renata walked Clara back to the station. The corridor smelled of cleaner and human effort. "You did the right thing writing it down," Renata said. "Document everything. If the committee needs more, we'll call you. I know how this looks on paper, but I know how you are here." Clara wanted to say that paper sometimes made monsters out of small things. Instead she said, "I don't want paperwork to take the place of care." Renata's face softened for the first time. "Neither do I." She put a hand on Clara's shoulder as if to steady more than the nurse, steadied the staff she knew meant a ward's safety. The preliminary inquiry had its own quiet gravity. A notice arrived on Clara's email with a clean header, a committee name, a request for additional times and witness names. There were protocols to follow, witness statements, logged entries, a timeline to be constructed that would exist separately from memory. The process moved in linear bureaucratic steps. It was less melodrama than a slow, grinding machine that recorded everything in a ledger of potential consequences. Word of the inquiry threaded its way into the ward's daily life in discreet ways. A printed memo appeared on a bulletin board with the hospital's seal. Dr. Fabio spoke at a handover meeting, his voice a pragmatic warmth. "We follow protocol," he said. "We will provide the statements, and we will maintain continuity of care." His meaning was clear, even if he could not guarantee every outcome. He would not be the one to call for Clara's removal without reason. He knew the stakes of losing a nurse mid-case. He knew how habit stabilized a fragile patient, but administration is often prickly about its image. Someone, somewhere, decided that the possibility of a complaint from a patient's relation required preemptive risk mitigation. Human beings crowded the edges of protocols, PR considerations, the hospital's name, a family with money. That pressure whispered through closed doors and into HR's calendar. Then, in a small, ugly way, the private began to leak. Someone in the administrative chain forwarded the barest outline, a complaint filed, an inquiry opened, to a member of the hospital's press office. A local blog, usually concerned with neighborhood restaurant openings and parking woes, picked up the hint and wrote a piece with a headline keen for outrage. The article did not know the particulars. It only knew friction and the immediacy of a story about a hospital and a wealthy family. It used the phrase staff encounter and the tone of speculation. Clara read it in the break room with her coffee cooling untouched. The smear on her scrubs looked like proof, an absurd thought that made her lips twitch with something like bitterness. Patricia, who had the reflexes of someone used to holding together schedules, slammed her hand on the table as if to strike the word down. "We'll not let them make this about you," Patricia said. "You hear me? We'll sign statements, we'll do whatever they need. You just keep doing what you do." "You keep doing what you do," Clara paraphrased, a small smile at the edge of tiredness. It was what they said to each other, an exchange of duty and love that had no drama but 1,000 small, sustaining acts. Renata called a staff meeting, the kind that smells of fluorescent light and reheated coffee. She kept it short. The memo she handed out read like a well-read instruction. Maintain documentation. Avoid interactions with the complainant. Ensure witness availability. There were ways for the hospital to protect itself on paper. There were ways it failed people in flesh. Renata walked the line between both with the practiced patience of an administrator who had seen policies chew people up before. "Temporary reassignment is possible," she said, not as a threat but as a fact. "It's standard in complaints like this to avoid perception of conflict while we investigate." Clara kept her expression neutral. The words landed like scales. Temporary reassignment meant removing the familiar hand from a fragile patient. It meant that another nurse, however skilled, might not provide the ritual of presence that Donna Lourdes relied upon. She considered what staying meant. She imagined the inquiry's items, log entries that, like teeth, might bite into a file, a committee that might pass tone as if a tired voice were incompetence. She thought of the small dum of routines that stabilized Donna Lourdes, the exact tilt of a pillow, the particular hour for a cup of tea, Clara's voice reading the market story. The patient's equilibrium hung on more than meds and vitals. It hung on the known. One night, a monitor's alarm flared in room 412. Clara had been on her feet for hours, but she was in the right place. The pattern on the screen that had been steady began to twitch, a small arrhythmia that required attention. She moved through steps, oxygen titration, call for a stat ECG, her body working in the practiced choreography of triage. Leonardo arrived mid-episode, breathless not because of exertion, but because he had been monitoring his mother from the chairs by the window. He watched Clara as if she was a person performing a skill he had never appreciated until he saw the stakes. When the rhythm steadied and the monitor sighed back into a calmer pulse, Leonardo's face unclenched. He turned to Clara with something that looked like gratitude and shame mixed. "You were here," he said simply, the sentence fragile in its own plainness. "Yes," she said, "I'm here." He stood there, watching the last traces of alarm settle, as if attempting to memorize the fact of her presence. For the first time since the car, his posture held not command, but a kind of stunned respect. Perhaps for the first time, he realized that money could not buy the knowledge she carried, the ways a person could read a little umbra on a monitor and know to act. That night, his mother slept more easily. He sat for a long time after visiting hours, hands clasped, looking at the window where the city was a pattern of moving lights. He had arranged for consultations, for private rooms, for any comfort he thought might help. He had tried to solve with resources what required human constancy. The fact that he had caused the problem by his impatience, by pushing a tired woman out of his car, sat like glass in his throat. A week passed in the slow rhythm of hospitals and inquiries. Statements were filed. Risk management met, minutes were recorded and stamped. The committee considered the chain of events and the definitions. Did the outside incident reflect on clinical conduct? The language was careful. It was also a form of distance. Distance favored neutrality, which sometimes meant losing the texture of human lives to the neatness of legalese. Then, at the precipice of a decision, Clara made a choice that surprised less those who knew her and more those outside her circle. She went to Renata with a small formal letter folded with the same steadiness she used when writing medication orders. I am submitting a voluntary request for reassignment from the care of Donna Lourdes Avelar during the period of the preliminary inquiry, she wrote, the words economical. This is to ensure the patient's continuity of care, to avoid any perception of conflict, and to preserve both my professional record and the patient's stability. I ask for reassignment to the step-down unit or similar. Renata read it, and for a second, the nurse coordinator's face registered something like reverence. You're doing this for the patient, she said. For the patient, Clara echoed. Saying it aloud made the act real in a way she had not expected. Volunteer removal was a paradox. She would leave the bedside to protect the patient's care from being compromised by the institution's machinery. It felt like an act both generous and necessary, and also a protest against being made to be the variable in someone else's discomfort. Renata folded the paper and set it in an envelope stamped with the hospital's administrative header. I'll process this as a voluntary request, she said. We'll have a formal meeting with HR and risk management. It will be on record that you chose this. Clara left the envelope on Renata's desk with the scrupulousness of a nurse handing over a chart. She felt a lurch of loss that was not entirely professional. It was, in part, a private grief for the rhythm she had helped set. But she knew the patient would survive the change. People survive many forms of absence. The question was, what would follow once the inquiry dissolved? When Renata filed the request, the administrative gears began to run in a different direction. A voluntary reassignment removed the easiest argument for removal by committee. It also preserved Clara's file from being marshaled into a narrative of incompetence. She had traded the bedside for the paper record in a way that aligned dignity and survival. Leonardo watched the ripple his complaint had set, the way the machine ground and the human cost it extracted. He made the decision to act in a different key. He called Dr. Augusto and asked for a meeting not as a man with influence, but as someone who wanted to correct the consequence of his impatience. He asked to retract his complaint, not merely to take it back on paper. He asked to actively intervene so the inquiry would be closed. Dr. Augusto listened with the cool intake of someone whose life is a ledger. A complainant may withdraw, he said slowly, but the inquiry may continue if there is institutional interest or risk. We must ensure patient safety. I understand, Leonardo said, but I filed it in haste and I regret it. I want to withdraw it and ask that you close the inquiry. It was harder than he expected. Institutions guard process jealously. They are not entirely swayed by contrition. Dr. Augusto requested a written retraction and an explanation. Leonardo composed a letter absent the veneer of purchase or apology bought by check. He wrote with his voice, which for the first time in a long while had the tremor of honesty. In his letter he wrote not to excuse himself, but to own the imbalance. He admitted his impatience, described the encounter without embellishment, and asked the hospital to accept his withdrawal. He asked for a formal note to be circulated to close the inquiry. His mother, he said, depended on human constancy, and he now understood that constancy could not be manufactured. When Renata received the letter and the request to withdraw the complaint, she placed it long on the corner of her desk and called Marisa at risk management. The exchange was economical. She reminded Dr. Augusto that the hospital's duty to investigate remained even with the complainant's withdrawal. Still, the committee could decide administrative closure if it found no institutional risk. There were conversations in closed rooms, official minutes typed that would one day sit in a folder. The committee weighed elements: a one-time outside incident, credible witness statements supporting Clara's clinical competence, no evidence of wrongdoing in the ward, patient stability under Clara's care, and a complainant's retraction anchored in acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The mechanical language of process finally found an alignment with the human reality in front of it. They closed the preliminary inquiry. The note that arrived in Clara's email said, in formal and efficient terms, that the inquiry would be archived administratively and that no disciplinary action would be taken. The words were small and official, but they carried the upshot of months of anxiety into a single, thin file. The closure was not a return to what had been. It was a punctuation mark that left the ledger tidy. Clara felt the announcement with the calm of someone who had expected both outcomes. She read the letter once, then again. A lift in her chest felt like being allowed to breathe a little more deeply. But she also felt a residue of something less easily catalogued, wary relief, the taste of institutional machinery even when it bent toward fairness. Leonardo asked for a meeting with Clara, nervous in a way that had nothing to do with money. The cafe beside the hospital had a dull, reliable light and a menu that felt like a small consolation. He invited her to meet in public. She agreed on the condition of civility, a parametric agreement that avoided theatricality. Clara arrived with the plainness of someone who had traded dramatic gestures for routine acts. A plain dress, a clean pair of shoes, the faint coffee stain still part of her stare of memory, though washed and faded. Leonardo arrived with the posture of someone who had learned something and was not yet comfortable in it. He stood when she sat and offered a cup of coffee with the nervousness of a man who had once offered comfort with bills rather than presents. "You didn't have to come," Clara said. "I wanted to," he said. "I owe you that." What followed was not a cinematic absolution. It was an ordinary conversation about something heavy. He spoke of the moment outside his car and the way he had chosen a tone rather than a question. He spoke of learning, which is a slow and sometimes humiliating process. He did not offer riches as apology because he had learned that gifts could be misread as bought forgiveness. He said he had withdrawn the complaint and asked the hospital to close the inquiry. He said he was sorry. Clara listened. She did not soften in a theatrical way. She accepted his words on their own terms, small, necessary, maybe true. She offered no scripted forgiveness. She told him what it had felt like to be dismissed in the street after a day of saving other people, how a single brusque sentence could rewrite a person's night. She did not make him a villain. She made him accountable. She told him the choice she had made to request reassignment and why she had done it, to protect her patient and preserve her professional record. He heard that too, with the uncomfortable humility of someone who finally understood the cost his action had exacted. He reached into his coat and took out the envelope he had been carrying, an offer of a different sort. Inside was not money, but a brief, handwritten note. "I am sorry for the way I acted. I will not let this stand without correction." It was not a performance. It was a small instrument of contrition. They sat with their coffees, steam mapping the space between them, and then Leonardo rose and left without fanfare. The exchange was adult and bounded. It changed nothing grandly. It shifted things on a human scale. Two people recognized the harm and took steps that were tangible. He withdrew his complaint. She had preserved the patient's continuity through a voluntary act, and both had moved in ways that implicated neither a moral victory nor a complete undoing. Back at the hospital, the closure memo circulated in administrative language. The committee endorsed archiving the case. Renata placed a small, handwritten note in Clara's locker that read simply, "Welcome back." It was small, almost private, but it felt like a lifeline. The days that followed had the soft business of recovery rather than the boom of triumph. Clara was reassigned to a step-down unit for a few weeks while things settled. It was not exile. It was a careful recalibration. Patricia covered shifts in the ICU and texted updates. Dr. Fabio arranged for periodic check-ins. The hospital system, which had shown its teeth and its tenderness in quick succession, eased into its normal oscillations. Donna Lourdes received a bouquet on a morning soft with rain. She opened her eyes and smiled when she saw the flowers and the familiar hand of Patricia adjusting her pillow. "Ah," she said, in the voice seasoned by markets and decisions. "The world gives us small things." When the day of discharge arrived, the ward had a feeling of completion rather than celebration. People moved with the usual precise kindness of those who know how endings are held. Donna Lourdes' clothes, a modest dress with a pattern like afternoon light, had been brought in and ironed. She sat by the window looking at the city, and she took Clara's hand. "You kept your promise," she told Clara, the words small but like a spark. Clara smiled and felt the old circle of care close. Leonardo stood nearby, a figure slightly stooped, as if the confession had reshaped him. He stepped forward and offered a handshake, an adult, public gesture that bore no demand for mercy. Clara took his hand. Her fingers were steady. The handshake was not a cure, and it was not a declaration of amity. It was instead a compact recognition that something had been acknowledged, and that with acknowledgement came the possibility of better behavior. Donna Lourdes watched them and squeezed Clara's hand with a private triumph. Outside the hospital, the light had turned the city soft with late afternoon gold. Donna Lourdes' daughter, Indefinido, a presence from the ward's visiting list, waited in a car. They lifted the older woman into the back seat with the careful choreography of people who have learned how to carry bodies and stories. Leonardo closed the car door, and in the reflection of the glass, Clara saw the brief outline of a man who had been troubled into a small, useful humility. Clara did not return to the ICU right away. She worked in a different wing with different rhythms, less acute, still meaningful. She kept the note Donna Lourdes had left, the small envelope she had tucked by the bedside, and pinned it inside her locker. On it, in Donna Lourdes' shaky but legible script, were 2 words, "For you." They were enough. Weeks later, as autumn began to sharpen the air, the ward held a small ceremony honoring staff, years of service. It was the kind of institutional ritual hospitals do. Certificates, a cake, a plate of modest sandwiches. People applauded and were applauded. When Clara stood to leave early, weary from the soft social obligations she never quite enjoyed, she passed by a wall where a photograph had been hung from a social event. Donna Lourdes at some family table, smiling, an image of life in small triumph. The photograph had been brought in by a visitor and taped on the community board. Clara paused and saw, in the corner, a folded piece of paper, an invitation to a family event perhaps, or a thank you note. The details did not matter. The image encapsulated something the hospital often forgot to say with words, that patients and caregivers carried mutual stories long after charts closed. Her phone vibrated with a message from Patricia. "Coffee tomorrow. New shift." Clara looked at the message, thought of the smear of coffee on the old scrubs, the new envelope in her locker, the handshake that had not erased all that had happened but had given a route for civil life to continue. She typed yes and felt, briefly, like someone who had built a small shelter and found friends waiting at the door. The public fuss dissolved into the hospital's many concerns. New admissions, a busier ER, a committee to review handover protocols. For Leonardo, the episode left a residue he could not purchase away. It had rerouted his instinct to fix everything with money into an awkward but more honest willingness to listen. He began to visit less as an errand of comfort and more as a practice of presence. The change was gradual and fragile. He still carried the memory of that night, the wrong door, a stranger's impatience, and it stayed with him as a small, chastening fossil. Clara kept working. The ICU murmured on without the melodrama of the complaint. There were nights that still made the coffee ritual feel like an essential rite. There were days when the tiredness returned in hard waves, and she remembered her grandmother's hands, the way they would smooth a rag and set a broken thing to rights. She learned to hold her own limits with the same tenderness she offered to others. Months later, she received an envelope at home. It was stamped with the hospital's insignia. Inside was a short letter from the board confirming the closure of the inquiry and noting the voluntary reassignment had been received with acknowledgement. There was a line that made her smile and also catch a small recommendation from Dr. Fabio for future consideration when assignments reopened. The bureaucratic languages had settled into a small, caring order. There was no dramatic reconciliation between Clara and Leonardo that rewrote the past. There was no sudden transformation that redeemed everything. Instead, there were practical acts. A complaint withdrawn, a voluntary choice taken to shield a patient, a meeting over coffee where accountability was accepted and received. There were small human openings, a handshake, a cup of coffee later shared across a table with fewer tremors. On a quiet afternoon, Clara stood by a hospital window, watching people move on the sidewalk below. Her scrub top was plain. The stain that had once marked a night of fatigue was a faded memory, not a talisman. She held the note from Donna Lourdes in her hand and felt the tightness of the life she had chosen settle into a kind of steady warmth. She had made choices that cost her sleep and comfort and sometimes the simplest companionship of a night shift. But they had also affirmed what she believed work could be, a way to hold others when they were diminished. She thought of the title that had landed in her life like an event, when the exhausted nurse mistakenly enters a millionaire's car and faces the consequences, and she found in it a human truth without easy edges. The mistake had been public and small. The consequences had been noisy and administrative. The repair had been possible, but not complete. Power had been used and then tempered by a recognition that money cannot simply buy the human continuity patients need. Respect had been withheld and then, in small gestures, reclaimed. When she crossed the hospital courtyard that afternoon, she saw Leonardo briefly as he was leaving. He nodded with the awkward humility of someone learning a new posture. She nodded back with the guarded generosity she had learned to give. It was not a moment of closure so much as one of continuation, to be civil, to be cautious, to accept that life would move forward in imperfect ways. At the corner where the hospital met the street, Sir Geraldo tipped his hat in recognition as he always did. Clara inclined her head back, a small return to the ordinary rituals that threaded the ward together. Inside her pocket, the note from Donna Lourdes warmed against her thigh as if it were a small human talisman. She kept the pen with which she had written the statement. It was blunt at the tip and had a smear of black ink on its side, a tiny badge of the night's work. When she met Patricia for coffee the next day, she ordered black and strong. They talked of small things, shifts, a new intern, a joke about bed numbers. The big event of months before hung around them like a weather system that had passed. It had rearranged their days in small ways, but it had also made the thing they did clearer: to stay, to do well, to choose dignity as a practice. And somewhere, in a life that would continue with imperfect repairs and cautious advances, Leonardo would teach himself to ask before he decided, to listen before he offered. Donna Lourdes would go home to whatever life waited, smaller errands, warm visits, and carry in a drawer or a pocket the idea that a hand had been present when it was most required. Clara walked back into the ward and hung her coat. The light in the corridor was steady, human-sized. She smoothed her scrubs and checked a monitor. The daily movements folded into a steady competence. The hospital's machines beeped and quieted. People breathed and slept and were woken and soothed. She placed the note from Donna Lourdes back into her locker and closed the door softly, as if to preserve something private against the loudness of consequence. If anyone asked her later about the incident, she would describe it as a sequence of simple facts and a demonstration of how institutions and people navigate power. She would say that a mistake on the street had been turned into a machine of inquiry, that the machine had teeth and conscience, that a man with influence had the capacity to hurt and then to repair in limited ways. She would say that she had made a choice to protect a patient and her own record, even if it meant surrendering a bedside she loved, because dignity sometimes asks for hard trade-offs. She would not tell them that the coffee stain had a ceremonial value. She would not tell them that a single handshake had repaired a soul. It had not. What she would say is simpler, that dignity had been preserved because people, colleagues, a coordinator, a doctor, a patient, had acted with integrity in their small spheres, and because someone with the means to do so chose, belatedly, to take responsibility for his impatience. And that was the measure the hospital often survived on, not the grand narratives, but the accumulation of small, adult acts, notes written in ink, statements filed with care, coffee shared across a table, a voluntary reassurance offered so a patient's sleep would not be disturbed. These things, mundane and profound, were the repairs that did not promise absolution, but did make continued life possible. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear a human, complicated account of dignity and consequence.